Redditors who were almost murdered. What's your story? Story 1. I was a clerk at an appliance repair shop. Some guy had brought his riding lawnmower in to be worked on, but decided it cost too much to have repaired, so my boss asked me to load it up in our lift truck and drive it to his address. I was 17 and had my relatively newly minted license on me, so it felt like a big responsibility and I was happy to do it. I loaded it up just fine and drove to his address. When I started to unload it, I noticed that the battery was unattached. One of the technicians must have removed it to work on it or something. Unfortunately, I had no tools with me to put it back in. I checked the work order and it said, "Customer declined repair, needs replacement engine." So I thought, he won't care because the engine is dead anyway. I rang the doorbell, and this fat, drunk guy with no shirt opens the door suddenly. I had lowered the riding mower off the lift truck and had pushed it into his yard. He yells, "What the hell are you leaving that pile of junk in my yard for?" I said, "Is this not your riding lawnmower?" He says, "Hell yes, it's mine, but it's in pieces and I don't want the damn thing. What the F is wrong with you people?" So I apologize and ask him if he wanted me to load it back up. I didn't even know what else to say. For some unknown reason, this ticked him off even more and he disappeared back in his house. I go back to the truck to radio my boss, this was back in the days before cell phones, to see what she wanted me to do. In the meantime, that drunk bastard stomps out onto his porch with a shotgun, leveled it at the truck, and pulled the trigger. The windshield shattered, and I literally couldn't hear anything but ringing from the noise. I jumped in the truck, started it up, put it in reverse, and floored it out of his driveway, almost going into the ditch on the other side of the road. He fires again, this time hitting the passenger side of the truck near the door, blowing shrapnel into the cab of the truck, which hit my leg and cut me a bit. I flew back to work faster than I had ever driven before, called my mom and dad, and told my boss I was never coming back to work there again. The cops came and took my statement, arrested the dumbass, and I had to testify against him a few months later, despite desperately never wanting to see him again. He only spent about 6 months in prison for it. Luckily, by the time things were settled, I had moved away to college, and didn't have to worry about him anymore. Story 2. I was 13 years old. My friend and I were out skateboarding, and for some reason this one woman got really angry that we skateboarded on the sidewalk in front of her house. She began screaming incoherently and we just laughed it off and kept going. My friend went one way and I went another. A minute later, I'm still just riding on the sidewalk to get back to my house, when all of a sudden the woman yelling from before pulls up beside me in her car and starts screaming again. Full disclosure, I replied with some expletives and told her to get away. I continued riding and she just drove slowly beside me while continuing to scream. The woman eventually drove off, but she did a U-turn and came back towards me. I expected her to just pass by and go home, but then I noticed she was actually driving directly at me. I froze and just watched her car come at me. Eventually, my brain decided I had to move. It was literally like a movie, and I dove away just as the car drove over where I was standing. I don't know her exact speed, but if I had to guess, it was like 30 or 40 miles per hour. She just continued driving and I sprinted home. She was later arrested and pled guilty to assault with a deadly weapon with intent to kill. Story 3. When I was in high school, a random new kid started stalking me, like following me home from school. I'd see him outside my house. He'd stand by my locker at school. He was weird. Told my counselor, but they didn't really believe me. Told a teacher I was close with and he talked to the principal and said they'd watch out. After about a week, my boyfriend was PO'd the school wasn't helping me. He confronted this kid and they almost fought physically. Finally, he got kicked out of the school and about a month later, less than 3 miles from my house, he strangled a girl my age who also went to my school and dumped her body in a field. Story 4. My ex and I got into an argument because he had become abusive, and I told him I was going to tell his family what he'd been doing. He got so angry at that he tried to grab me, but I ran out of the room. He headed for the gun closet, so went outside to make sure when he killed me, the neighbors would see it. I called 911 outside, and for some lucky reason, they were just blocks away. When they got there, he was in the middle of loading the Remy 700. I pressed charges, and he only got 1 night in jail. His dad bailed him out, and despite me getting a 5-year restraining order, I'd run into him around town. He pled no contest and got 3 years probation. That's it. I moved 3,000 miles away, but I'm still scared of him. Story 5. I was a freshman in college, and in my first semester, pledged a fraternity. One night, I was assigned to work the door at a party, which wasn't uncommon. Around 1:30 to 2 a.m., a group of guys that worked the dining hall, I remembered the one because he made an amazing cheesesteak, showed up and each paid $5 per cup. A few minutes after they paid, the last keg kicked and none of them got any beer. As soon as they told me that the kegs just kicked, I started counting out cash to pay them back for the cups they just bought. Before I could get them their money back, one of my drunk pledge brothers decided to physically force them out the door while yelling and berating them. As soon as I could calm my buddy down, I went outside to give them their cash back, only to be met with a big surprise. When I made it down the back steps, Cheesesteak Guy aggressively steps forward and says, "Y'all made a big effing mistake. I'm a strapped MFer." He then pulls out a handgun out of his waistband and points it directly between my eyes. In that moment, it was remarkable that 18-year-old me didn't crap my pants. A few of the older guys in the house stepped outside and they were able to talk the guy down without incident, but it felt like I had that gun pointed between my eyes for an eternity. Long story short, I was incredibly lucky that I didn't get shot that night. Needless to say, I went without cheesesteaks for a few semesters after that night. Story 6. When I was 19, I dated a girl whose dad was a psycho, was probably just over 5 feet tall, but all muscle. Did a bunch of time in prison for drugs and violent crimes. Once he had a guy cut him off in traffic. He followed the guy and finally boxed him in, tore his car door open and held a knife to the guy's crotch, threatening to cut his dong off until he wet himself. It's that level of crazy. Well, me and her lived together in an apartment. I worked afternoons and she worked days. There was a couple hours in the afternoon when no one was there. Had a day off one day and was running some errands. Came home in that time frame when no one was normally home, and her father came walking out of our bedroom. I asked him what he was doing there, and he told me because he liked me, he would be honest. He said he was there to rob us. He was on drugs and was in the middle of a crime spree. He held up a bunch of people in the complex who were entering or leaving the building, then came through our bedroom window. He said he looked around and didn't find anything, so he was on his way out. He said he wouldn't hurt me, but if I ever told anyone this happened, including his daughter, I would disappear, and no one would ever find me. And then he just walked out. The whole time he was talking to me, all I could think of was, don't give him a reason to attack me. That, and I had a coffee cup in the living room with almost $1,000 in it. Thankfully, he didn't find that. Luckily, I never saw him again. My relationship was on the rocks, and this gave me the needed push to get out of there. I never told anyone what happened until after he died. Edit. Just thought of another situation where he could have killed me, and also demonstrates how crazy he was. So he went away on a hunting trip, and while he was gone, I came over one day after she got home from school. She was a senior in high school at the time. Her mom was at work, and we just sat around on the couch for a couple hours. No exaggeration, 3 hours after we got home, he comes walking out of the front coat closet. He tells us he wanted to see what we would do if we thought he was out of town, so he got home early and waited in the closet, peeping on us to see what we would do. Once he felt like nothing was going to happen, he came out, but I can't imagine what he would have done if we started fooling around. Story 7. I've told this before, but I witnessed a murder directly in front of me while I was sitting in my Jeep with the top down. 2 guys were arguing on the sidewalk. I was just sitting there. They knew I was there and didn't care. One guy pulled out a homemade shank from his pant leg and straight-armed it into the other guy's eye. I will never forget the crunching sound when that blade went into his face. The murderer looked at me once and bolted. I ran up to help, but the guy was screwed. Blood spouting out of his eye in gushes, and he was moaning horribly. He died as the ambulance arrived. I was the only witness and nearly testified in court, but the guy just pled guilty and got 15 to 25 years. I still have nightmares about that 25 years later. Story 8. So I was backpacking in South America and was getting a bus between cities in Brazil. As you might know, night buses are routinely robbed, and I was unlucky enough to be on a bus at the time. Being the only foreign person on the bus, they obviously rinsed me dry. Passport, cash, phone, all gone. I was then locked in the luggage compartment till they had left the scene, all while having a gun pointed at me. Now that sucked. But what sucked even more was a week later when I was getting another bus and it was robbed again. Again, they went straight to the only foreign person on the bus who didn't speak Portuguese and demanded all the stuff the previous robbers stole off me. I was pretty much crying with a gun in my face as I had nothing to give them. They took me outside the bus and I thought for sure I was going to be killed. But again, they just locked me in the luggage compartment while they robbed everyone else. I booked flights from then on. Edit. Even though I got mugged twice, Brazil is still the best country I've ever visited. All this happened in 2011, and I made friends for life during the 8 months I was in South America. Some tourists, but a lot of Brazilians. I wouldn't let my experiences put you off. Just stay safe and don't be an idiot like me. I totally recommend going to visit, even if you just stay in the touristy areas. I was young and foolish when I was there. I went to the favelas outside of organized tours and took too many drugs and drank too much. I didn't think I was invincible, I just didn't care as long as I wasn't killed. I was probably lucky I only got mugged twice. I did also get dengue fever in the rainforest and got the equivalent of trench foot by sleeping in wet boots for too long while in the Amazon. Nonetheless, definitely go spend a week in Rio. Story 9. I was working at a gas station. It was at night and slow, so I was sitting in the office watching TV. All of a sudden, one guy comes in behind me, and then another guy comes in front of me. Guy in front says, "Don't get up." I give him the wad of cash from my breast pocket and then the money from my front pocket, and they rush out back into the darkness. I stay put just like the guy said, then I call the owner. A car pulls up to get gas. I tell them they need to pay by credit card or exact change because I just got robbed. Then I reach up to touch my neck. It was bloody. The guy in the back was holding a knife to my throat. Story 10. I was getting screamed at by my ex as usual. I don't remember what I said/did, but he grabbed my arm and pulled me off the couch. He started hitting me, not the first time. I'd never seen him so angry, and I'd long since taught myself to not react and give him the feeling of having power over me. If I didn't cry, he would get bored and just stop. Next thing I know, he pushes me up against the wall and wraps his hands around my throat. I was having a hard time breathing, but I still wouldn't cry. Just as I was about to pass out, I gathered all my strength and punched him in the ribs as hard as I could. He dropped me, and before I could catch my breath, I hit him in the balls. When he was down, I kicked him in the ribs a couple times and locked myself in the bathroom until he came and started his usual apologies. I knew I needed to get out, and 2 weeks later, I did. It's been 8 years since. Story 11. The last time I saw my ex. I broke up with him while we sat in his car at a park. After choking me until I passed out, he got onto the freeway and drove 100 miles per hour while slamming my head into the window and dashboard. I was able to get out of the car at one point when he got off the freeway and ran into the street screaming, trying to wave down a car, but no one stopped. He was forcing me into his trunk when a man pulled over and started filming him, and I ran onto a bus. I won't ever forget how his eyes looked and that he was absolutely silent the whole 2 hours. I moved across the country after his mom called me panicking to warn me he was looking for me. Story 12. I was coming home from a bachelor's party at 2 a.m., and on the way home I realized that we had all forgotten the steak dinner portion of the evening that we had all planned. I didn't want to wake my wife and baby, drunkenly rummaging around the kitchen, so I had the taxi drop me off at the Dunkin' Donuts a half-mile from my house. This was pre-Uber times. I got myself a couple egg and cheese bagels and started walking home. Now, I made sure to take the quieter neighborhood street rather than the busier street in order to avoid potential drunk drivers. However, about a block into the neighborhood, I see a pair of dudes coming my way down the sidewalk. I consider crossing the street but realize how insulting that would be to the two men clearly just walking home from a fun evening just like me. When they're a few feet away, I give them a "how are you doing" nod, and they returned with their own. I was so proud of my decision to treat them like fellow bros and not be so suspicious. Then, as they walk past me, one of them pulls his hand up in the air holding a tire iron and strikes me in the back of the head hard. I fall into the street from the impact but remain conscious. One holds my arms down while the other climbs on my legs and starts rifling through my pockets. I tell them to take what they want, and they tell me to shut up or they'll kill me. Then they ask me where my wallet is, and when I tell them which pocket it's in, they tell me to shut up or they'll kill me again. They took my wallet, phone, and watch, and then kicked a few more times in the head, and then took off. I was bleeding and super concussed, and without a phone at 2:30 a.m., and there was no way I could make it home on my own. I saw a house nearby where the flickering light of a TV could be seen in an upstairs bedroom. I crawled over to the house and pulled myself up onto the porch and leaned against the door and knocked and hollered for help. The homeowner was rightfully scared and didn't want to open the door at that hour for a stranger who wouldn't even stand up to be seen through the front door's viewfinder. I was feeling very faint at this point and was covered in blood from the head wound, but convinced him to call 911 and get an ambulance. I also asked if he would call my wife. At that point, he seemed to feel more confident that I wasn't trying to trick him, and offered me a cordless phone through a chained door. He said he wanted to help, but I needed to stay out on the porch because he had just redone his floors and I was bleeding way too much. When the EMTs arrived, they decided they should take me to the better hospital instead of the one a few blocks away. But the route to the other hospital required several blocks of driving on cobblestones. In experience, I would not recommend to any concussed individuals strapped to a gurney in the back of an ambulance. I needed 24 staples in my head, and the doctors all told me how lucky I was to have survived such a massive blow to the head with a blunt object. But the saddest part is, I never actually got my egg and cheese bagels. Story 13. I was staying at the Extended Stay America in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, in the summer of 2018. Had my dog outside to go do her business, and as I was walking her back inside, a car pulls up and stops. Just before I can open the door, I hear, "Hey, nice dog." I turn around and see some dude step out and literally pull out a knife. I don't say a word, tell my dog to jump, grab her mid-jump, run inside, and slam the door shut, breaking the lock into the engaged position in the process. The building was and still is incredibly worn down and barely held together with toothpick-level materials. I wind sprint to my room and unlock the door with the card key. Just as I walk in, I look out the exterior window in the hallway and see the dude actually looking into the building to presumably see which room I'm staying in. I get into my room, lock the door behind me, call the front desk, and simply say that the back door to the building's lock is busted. Oh, and also that some dude in the back area parking lot is walking around with a knife. I hear the clerk say, "Again? Alright, I'll call the police in." Story 14. When I was young, maybe 4 or 5 years old, my family lived in a small town of about 1,200 people. It was mostly a farming town. My dad was the manager of the only bank in town. A farmer missed some payments on a loan, so the bank foreclosed and took his farm. This farmer apparently blamed my father personally, so he went to the bank with a rifle and threatened my father. My father talked to him, cops were called, and the farmer was arrested and arraigned. Bail was posted for the farmer, so he was released from jail. A few days later, my family was eating dinner and we heard a truck pull up and park in front of our house. It was a really quiet street in a small town, so my father went up to the front window to see who pulled up. It was the farmer, and this time he had a shotgun. He walked right up to the front door and knocked. And my family hauled it out the back door and ran to a neighbor's house. Our front door was unlocked, so he could have just opened it and blasted us all, but I guess he didn't think to check. Cops were called again and the farmer was arrested. My family spent the next week or so in a hotel a few towns away until it was assured that the family would be in jail without the possibility of bail. Story 15. My ex-stepfather is bipolar. After my mom left him, he had another manic episode. He broke in and pulled a gun on us. He told me to go to my room and not to call the police. I was 11. I called the police. When they pulled up, he shot through the door to my bedroom and emptied the clip. I had already grabbed my cat and was outside under the deck. I'm just glad he shot the door and not my mom. My half-sister was born later that year. At her funeral, he showed up and kept trying to talk to me. He couldn't understand why I refused. He was never charged and has no memory of the incident. He spent a weekend at a mental hospital and then was released to go to work. As a teacher, I really don't understand how all of this was ignored and he was considered an upstanding teacher and person. Story 16. I was about 18, female, and just moved to the city for university. Driving near downtown and I see police lights behind me. I pulled over and a man in plain clothes gets out of an unmarked car, and when he's close to my window, I see another man getting out of the passenger's side, also in plain clothes, walking up to the other side of my car. I freaked and floored it out of there. I think I ran over their foot, then I went the wrong way down several one-way streets and ended up driving an hour away in one direction because I was afraid they would follow me. I called the police to make sure they hadn't actually pulled me over, which they hadn't. They never found the guys. Story 17. Probably a little late to the party, but I'll give it a go. I was a firefighter for 15 years or so. As a rookie, I responded to a smell of natural gas call. Fairly common. Usually what happens is I just stand around with the lights flashing until the gas company shows up. To this day, it is still the most gas volume-wise I've experienced in a residential setting. I could smell gas from the cab of the engine from 5 blocks out. Anyway, long story short, 2 of us, firefighters, and 2 cops ended up making entry into the residence the gas appeared to be coming from. We were able to wedge open the basement entry garage doors, old-school flip-up style doors. 4 of us marched single file into the dark garage to a door in the back corner that led into the basement. The only gear I had on was my boots and bunker pants. Anyway, the amount of gas in the garage was almost overwhelming. The door into the basement had a glass window, and the lead officer was using his flashlight to look around inside as he opened up the door. Right as the lead officer was yanking the door open, he spotted someone inside and started yelling. We all rushed in and it was dark and really humid. Crazy amount of natural gas. You could hear it hissing in. I think I was the third in line. Only got maybe 3 steps in before colliding with the 2 officers in front of me who had stopped short. I remember the lead officer just plainly stated in a kind of defeated tone, "He has a lighter." Definitely one of those moments where 3 or 4 seconds feels like an eternity. But sure enough, in the back corner of this basement, slumped back in a ratty old recliner, was a middle-aged, skinny dude with an orange Bic lighter in his hand. And that jerk flicked the thing at least twice while I was looking at it. I assume he had flicked it once or twice before, which is what caught the officer's attention. Anyway, the 4 of us just kind of stood there like idiots, staring at this dude in his recliner for what felt like forever, waiting for the inevitable explosion. I remember distinctly wondering how big of a crater was going to be left behind. Obviously, nothing happened. Once our fight or flight worked its way out, the 4 of us collectively kind of bum-rushed the dude. He didn't put up much of a fight, and I was surprised to find him nearly unconscious. We had to carry him out. Dude had busted open the main gas line feeding his house where it entered his basement, had left a suicide note and everything. He was completely unconscious for the ride to the hospital. Medics stuck an NPA in, and I bagged him the entire way. Not sure what happened to him, or if he even intended to try and take others with him. I think the concentration of gas was too high, above the UEL of natural gas, which I think is around 15%. The basement, or at least the area immediately around the recliner, was essentially flooded with too much fuel and not enough O2 to ignite. I was definitely a little lightheaded after spending what was likely less than a minute in the basement. Learned a lot of valuable lessons that day I try to pay forward.